Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Erica Daniels. I'm the incoming Executive Artistic Director at Victory Gardens Theater here in Chicago. And I'm so honored and thrilled to welcome John Logan to this wonderful event that we're hosting, part of our Your World Offstage series. Welcome, John Logan. How are you?
Thank you, Erica. We are certainly off stage right now.
We are off
This is
stage.
my office. This is where it all happens. Couldn't be further from stage.
Couldn't be further. Well, we're gonna talk about many of those posters behind you, perhaps. It's certainly fitting. John, for those that don't know, you've been a friend of Victory Gardens and were part of our original Playwrights ensemble, and have stayed on our artistic advisory committee, and have become a friend of mine over the last year. And it's really wonderful to have this time with you. I want to start by really talking about, how you found your way into writing and why it was writing that became your calling, and what it is about language that you find so important and beautiful.
Yeah, it was very much language is the key word, because, as a kid, my father is a naval architect. My parents are from Belfast. And I was born in San Diego, moved all over the country growing up every 2 or 3 years because my dad would go from port city to port city working. So I had to make friends very quickly. And I relied on books a lot, because they were always there. And I was always sort of an eager young reader and always very sort of theatrical. I loved the idea of like make-believe and dressing up and, but the sort of the seminal event for me, and it sounds apocryphal, but I swear this is true. I was living in San Pedro, California. I think I was 8. And my dad asked me to watch a movie with him. And it was Olivier's Hamlet. And like, if there was a moment that I became myself, it was that moment. Because that movie had everything I loved as a kid, ghosts and horror, still the most amazing sword fight ever put on screen. And it had this other thing. And that thing was Shakespeare. And my dad, who was raised, in Belfast on Shakespeare and British poetry, just encouraged me. We would read the plays together, and I just became Shakespeare crazy at like 8 years old. It was a strange world. I loved my Star Trek and I loved my Shakespeare. And so I wanted to be part of that thing. And like everyone, I thought that meant I should be an actor. So, I did shows in high school. It was great. I loved it, and it's not so much that I loved acting. And you'll understand this, and anyone who's worked in the theater understands this. What I loved about it was when I went into a rehearsal, it was a safe space. I was a skinny, asthmatic, gay kid, in California and New Jersey when I was growing up. But when I went into a rehearsal room, it was, I had my tribe around me. Mm-hmm. And from that day to this, it's the exact same. Whether I'm walking into Milburn High to rehearsal O'Dali or walking into rehearsal Moulin Rouge, it's the safe space where I feel I can be most at ease. Absolutely. But I thought I wanted to be an actor, so I went to Northwestern, because where else would you go? And I quickly discovered acting was not for me, because sort of the emotional honesty that it requires of great actors, wasn't my gig. And, in my class, there was like Julie Louis-Dreyfus. The class behind me was Dennis O'Hare. So there were great actors around who, like, their DNA fit that. But I still took the whole playwriting, the whole acting class, the sequence from a teacher named David Downs, who used to teach at Northwestern. He was an amazing teacher. And I took a lot of classes in what was then called interpretation, it's now called performance studies at Northwestern. And I worked with like Dwight Conkergood and Paul Edwards, and all of that is about exploring text through performance. And then in my senior year, I took a playwriting class from Linda Jenkins, and that was it. I started writing my first play, which was Never the Sinner, about the Leopold and Loeb case. I have the first draft over here, in fact, that I typed in my old Smith Corona typewriter at Northwestern. And that was it. I just realized it was like when you're driving in a freeway, which we do a lot in LA, and you get into the right lane and all the cars are going in the right speed and you feel this is where I belong. The minute I started researching that play and then writing it, I thought, oh, this is what I'm supposed to do, this exact thing. Because it was the culmination of everything I loved, exploring language, being theatrical, not having to act, not having to direct, and just do this one thing. So that was it.
It's so funny because now I know why we get along. I am a performance studies major from Northwestern. So all of the people you just named were incredibly important and pivotal in my life as well. Dwight and Paul, I still keep in touch with. So it's very funny. I totally know of what you speak about. For me, it was the process, right? It was the process was interesting, and rehearsal and finding my tribe. And then once we did it once for an audience, I was like, oh, we have to do this again. I'm ready for the next process. So I totally know that. So talk to me, you graduated from Northwestern and you had this calling in playwriting. And in the early days, in the 80s and 83, you were a member of this company called the Stormfield Theatre, correct? And there were people like Terry McCabe were a part of this. So tell us what you were part of this original storefront movement here in Chicago.
Yeah, it was like such an exciting time to be in Chicago and to be young and broke and wanting to make theater. Because we were all broke, we all had day jobs. Mine was working at the Northwestern Law Library, shelving books for 10 years, mind you. And everyone was just eager to make theater. It didn't matter what it was, you had to get it out there. You had to get together with your friends and start making theater. And Terry McCabe was the artistic director of Stormfield and was a graduate student at Northwestern, so I knew him from there. And he loved Never the Sinner. So that was my first production in Chicago. And it was, it was on Sheridan Road, up some stairs, above a bowling alley in a building that no longer exists. But it was magnificent. And, I wrote 10 plays, in 10 years. I just kept writing them. I work all day, write all night. Some were good, some were bad, and some were in a church basement, some were in theaters, some were, because there was a great hunger in Chicago, and still is, for new work. Not for classics, not for musicals, not for road shows, for actual new work that were new voices. I was following in the comet that was David Mamet, and the Atlantic Theater Company had come out and just blazed a trail. And then there was this thing called Steppenwolf, just a few years ahead of me. So people were starting to take note of what Chicago was doing and all the voices that were emerging. So it was a thrilling time, and that's where I learned my craft, because I didn't write my first movie till I was 30. So I had spent 10 years just being a struggling playwright. But in that process, I learned, how do you talk to a director about a scene? What do you say to an actor? What do you not say? How do you talk about a production design? What does a poster mean? How do you sell tickets? So the whole sort of gestalt of theater, which when you're struggling in Chicago, you're doing everything all at once. It was a great education for me.
Right. I mean, you worked with Chicago stalwarts like Tom Mula and Ross Lehman, who are still here, very engaged in the community.
Yeah. And it was a great, Claudia Allen and Rick Cleveland, Scott McPherson, it was like, this is a romantic picture, but it was like our Paris in the 20s. And we were like the lost generation. We had no one but each other. None of us had a cent of money. We all celebrated each other and were incredibly jealous of each other. And it was really exciting, but it was really Victory Gardens that finally gave me sort of a home, per se, because it was a peripatetic thing. You're going to theater, to director, working your way up, trying things, failing, not failing, and what an emerging artist needs more than anything is a safe place to fail, because anyone can succeed and then they have to deal with the ramifications of that, which are tricky, but not everyone can fail comfortably and fail safely. And, it was then, Dana Zacek, Fanny Schinner, Marcy McVeigh liked me, liked my work, and supported me and said, you have it, we'll put it on. Not like, what is it? Will you audition it for us? Should we do a reading of it? Which is now, so as you know, the declension to how things get on. But there was such a commitment to the young and emerging talent, of artists of color, women artists, gay artists, to just try anything and put it on. And some will work and some won't work, but how are you going to get better unless you try? So it's, having that support was elemental, especially because I had no money. I had this horrible day job, not horrible day job, but I had a day job, to feel there was a place that really had your back, no matter what. And that's why Victory Gardens is still so important to me. I mean, I've worked in Grand theaters, I've worked on Broadway, I've worked on the West End, but you know, it's not the same as when you're in desperate need of people to hear you, you know, and to fight with you and to tell you you're wrong and to teach you how to be a playwright, because it's not easy.
Right.
It's not easy being a playwright.
And Dennis, I've read enough, you know, about him that he really wanted Victory Gardens to be, you know, a big tent that invited everybody in, and really set that standard high for inclusive voices that we still have today. So I understand that.
Yeah, and there was a great synergy amongst the theaters, because, you know, in my day, Victory Gardens was downstairs in the old space. Victory Gardens was downstairs. Body Politic was upstairs. You could take the L to Wisdom Bridge. You could go to Remains, wherever they were then, you know, and everyone supported each other,
Yes.
you know, because what else were we going to do? No one was getting famous or rich.
Exactly. And I read that, you know, the Stormfield Theatre, it only lasted like 4 years because Terry didn't think the storefront scene in Chicago was going to have longevity. So I imagine that's a bit of a joke amongst all of you, like, oh, I guess we could still be existing today if we really had it in us.
Yeah, really. But I find that, I mean, frankly, I find that so gratifying, because it's you know, when I go to London, what I look for is fringe theater. You know, I like the RSC as much as the next man, but it's like where you find the most exciting, like, genesis of modern voices in the theater, it's not going to be necessarily at the Goodman. It's not necessarily going to be, you know, at the National Theater.
Yes, it's very true. So what was your first produced play at the Garden, Sean? Was it, I was trying to track it, if it was I know you did Scorched Earth. I know Hauptmann had a revival in '91 back with Dennis and Terry, and I want to talk about that. But what was your very first produced play?
Oh, wow. Honestly, I've been, you know, I have many Victory Gardens badges on my jacket, so it's hard to remember. You know, the original plays, we did a show called Moonlight Can Be Cruelly Deceptive, which was great, that Dennis directed. And then we did Scorched Earth with our friend Martha Levy acting, also. And then we did Never the Sinner a couple times. And,
Right.
and the really, you know, the really important one in terms of like my career per se was Hauptmann, which was done originally at Stormfield, you know, teeny little theater, and 12 people saw it, but Dennis really liked it and sort of allowed us to remount it, which went to Edinburgh, which led to my first London production, which led to sort of everything else eventually.
Right. And I did see that production in '91. That was my first real John Logan experience, and my first Dennis O'Hare experience, of course, live in that very intimate space, which was, you know, just a magical experience, obviously.
Yeah.
So at what point did you feel either the urge, or were you pulled to LA and film, you know, in terms of writing for?
It was, you know, 10 years in of writing plays and really making, you know, very little money, having some success, some not success. And I was never sort of desperate to like, oh, I have to buy a house and have money. But, you know, there are times in you know, a writer's life when it can get really grim and tough. And it was certainly one of those times. And, you know, I've always loved movies. I mean, as I say, the genesis of my theater was a movie. It was Olivier's Hamlet. So I always wanted to write a movie. I always thought that would be great. And at Northwestern at the time, when I was a student, there was a teacher named Frank Galati, who was an amazing, you know, teacher in the then performance studies department, who was a real mentor to me. And he had just written a screenplay for Accidental Tourist, which I believe he was Oscar nominated, you know, and a terrific writer. And I sort of talked to him about it a little bit, you know, and he gave me a great piece of advice, which was relax and be an artist, you know. And we talked a little bit about how do you lead a reader through a screenplay page? You know, how do you do that? What should it look like? Because I just read lots of screenplays, you know, and he talked about, here's the two ways to write a screenplay. One is close up on, gnarled hand, reaching for teacup. And the other one is, you know, you see the woman's hand reaching through space, she gently touches a teacup. And so, you know, he taught me a lot about how to do the form. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, great. And so I decided to write a screenplay about pro football because I love football. And of course, like everyone in Chicago, the Fridge, Jim McMahon, Ditka, I lived through that celebration, that wild celebration. I just love football, you know, like a proper Chicagoan. And I really controversially did not like baseball. And there were so many baseball movies out. No one had done a pro football movie in forever. So I said, okay, I'm going to write this movie. So I talked to my then agent, who was actually still my agent, the only agent I have ever had, a man named Brian Siberel,
Oh my
who I
God.
met when he was working in New York for a division of HBO that no longer exists. And I said, I want to write this football movie. And he said, well, we can't sign you because you haven't done anything. And we're CAA, the biggest agency in the world. But if you write this movie, I'll rep it for you. You know, and I said, okay. He said, here's the deal you have to make. You know, this is like, actually, my life is very boring. This is the most dramatic thing that's ever happened to me. He said, all right, I'll rep this if you take a year off writing plays and just concentrate on one screenplay, on learning this. So I did. So I stopped writing plays for a year. I was so broke, you know, it was the point of like, I was eating tuna fish every day. I learned how to debone chickens because it was cheaper, you know, how to live on ramen noodles all week, you know, how to tear the corner of checks so they don't cash, so that you'll have time to, you know, so it was a very tough period. But I wrote Any Given Sundays, this movie about pro football. I got to hang out with the Bears and, you know, just really soak it all up. And I'm like, you know, I'm this kid, this gay playwright kid, you know, walking in and saying, I want to learn about football. And people were so open, you know, because I was just very open about, I don't know what I'm doing and I need to learn all this. So I wrote Any Given Sunday. I sent it to Brian, my agent, and then I was in Adelaide, Australia, working on a new play, in fact. And he called me a week later and said, Oliver Stone wants to talk to you about this movie. And that was it.
It is an unbelievable story. So
No, it's also useless to young screenwriters because they're always like, well, what were the steps to becoming a screenwriter? I'm like, I didn't have any. I wrote a big movie that was produced. That was my step. But the real step was 10 years in Chicago learning how to be a dramatist, obviously.
yes, it is still a wonderful story. You've had you've had great film relationships, obviously. You know, you've worked twice with Martin Scorsese, twice with Ridley Scott. What do you think it is about you and these artists that really foster collaborative relationships repeatedly? Because I think that's just the mark of a real collaborative team, repeatable relationships. And right. I admire that about you.
Right. Well, it's, you know, my closest relationship is always with directors, you know, whether it's Joe Mantello or Michael Granage or Alex Timbers, the people I work in the theater with, you know, every day, you know, or with film directors. And that's the key relationship for a dramatist, because you can take your work so far and then you have to hand it over to another artist with vision to bring it to the audience. And that's what a director does. And so from my very first productions with Terry McCabe, with Dennis Zacek, or Bob Falls, I was learning how to do that and learning how to talk to directors. Understand me, it became important not that they speak my language, but that I speak theirs. You know, because my language is the play. The words are always going to be the words. But every director approaches a text and a piece of art differently. And you have to understand how they're thinking. You have to get into their minds to be able to communicate effectively about what the material is. And I found that a relatively easy transition into filmmaking. And when I first started working in Hollywood, I made a list of directors. It wasn't movie stars, it wasn't studios, it was directors I wanted to work with because I admired their work so much. And I was so excited by the idea of collaboration with them. You know, and most of those relationships have been really, really positive, you know, because I also understand what my job as a screenwriter is. You know, I don't consider myself an auteur. I consider myself a craftsman. I think I'm a very good craftsman when it comes to writing movies, you know, and I'm very proud of the work I do, but it's not like writing a play. You know, you have to have, as a screenwriter, a great deal of humility to the process, because the process is so huge And if I'm fighting every battle on every line, I'm going to lose the war. So it became necessary to me to learn what's really important to me, and working with people like, Tim Burton and Ridley Scott and Michael Mann and Marty Scorsese, taught me how to do that in terms of what's really important. And, I'm an amiable guy. And I think also what these directors appreciate more than, I think what anyone who works with me appreciates most, and I say this with humility, is I work really, really hard. I take my job seriously. It is arduous to learn your craft, and it is difficult to keep doing it day after day after year after year. And I get up at 4:00 every day and I go to work just like someone who drives a cab. And I work and I work and I work. And that's the exhilaration I feel in my job. I'm not a perfectionist. I realized, you can find perfection in collaboration with other people, with an actor or a choreographer or a director. But to get my work as good as it can be, it's just hard work. And I don't wait for the muse. I don't believe in the muse. I believe you go and you do your job. And if it's what you're meant to do, it'll come. And it's hard, but it'll come. So the deepest relations I have, with Sam Mendes or Marty Scorsese, it's because an appreciation of what I bring to the table.
Before I go on to my next question, John, I want to let you know that Marianne Philbin, who was on the board of Stormfield, is on. And is really saying that the closing of Stormfield really was about limited funding options. That was an early time for people really to talk through foundations and support, and but that what a special and brilliant place it was, and that you were a part of that. So I just want to acknowledge Marianne's being on this call with us.
That's very nice. That's very nice.
John, do you think there's a common, you've written about so many different things. I think of from Gladiator to Moulin Rouge, just this range, but do you think there's a common thread in your work?
Thematically, no. As I think stylistically, I have a certain panache and a certain operatic grandeur I'm not afraid of. And I don't, every playwright will tell you, there's a couple of models. There's Mr. Shakespeare and Dr. Chekhov, And Chekhov can break your heart with a tiny sensitive moment. It's the famous teacup moment. It's like, have the cup of tea and your life will change. And it's so detailed and filigree, where Shakespeare gives you the grand thundering panorama of life. And I'm not a Chekhovian writer. I have incredible respect for that. I wish I could do that more, but I can't. I'm drawn to the big characters and the big drama, which suits a lot of movies. I wish I could do other things, but I don't really, because I'm very happy doing what I'm doing. But a play like Red, I remember when I was first talking to people about it, and they were like, "What? You're going to do a play about soup painters in a studio? Okay, without an intermission, just the two of them painting and talking about art." And I said, yeah, but it's going to be operatic, Yes, it's naturalism, but it's heightened naturalism. So if there's any, I guess the answer, Eric, is what I'm drawn to is things that are heightened and passionate.
Got it. And you've written, I think it's really fascinating because you've written blockbuster chain, parts of chain movies, right? Star Trek, Bond. Do you enter those in any, obviously there's legacy involved and there's the knowledge of what has preceded you when you enter that space, but beyond that, does your process change in any way, or do you?
Yeah, it does because of the legacy. Because if I adapt, I adapted Coriolanus with Ralph Fiennes, so my collaborator there was William Shakespeare. If you're working on a Bond film, you're collaborating with Ian Fleming and every other Bond film that's been ever made, because you're part of a continuum. And part of the joy of it is you are part of a continuum. So you have to feel where this story fits in that continuum. And it's always been a pleasurable experience. It's not like riding with handcuffs on. And people always say about franchises, well, you have to leave the toys back in the toy box when you're done. I'm like, well, we killed Judi Dench, so you don't, You just have to have people brave enough to say, you got to throw some of the toys out of the box, or there is no drama. And that's why, you know, I've been approached a lot about doing things like Marvel movies and DC movies, and it's just not my thing. It's not my game. Because to me, that is too much. There are certain limitations around what you can possibly do. But look, it all depends on the people you're working with. You know, Rick Berman, who was running the Star Trek franchise, was very open for Star Trek Nemesis to do different things. You know, Barbara Broccoli and Michael Wilson, you know, for Bond, are very open to exploring new things and trying out, you know, new sort of experiences.
What is it like? And I don't even know if this has been a piece of your world. You know, I think with film writing, there's the notion of multiple writers, people taking on films. So, you know, playwriting it's a solo process. You are the playwright most of the time. People are not, you might have a dramaturg steering you, but you are certainly the voice. How has that experience been in terms of the LA process? Does it, did your playwriting collaborative background really just help you in that moment go, this is a process, it's collaborative, and that my ego isn't necessary to bring into that? Or is that difficult sometimes?
Well, it is difficult sometimes. I mean, I have been sensationally lucky in collaborations, you know, because they were always very comfortable and respectful. You know, 3 writers worked on Gladiator. You know, first David Franzoni wrote a terrific script, and then when Ridley came on, I came on with Ridley, and then I went off to The Last Samurai, and Bill Nicholson came on. But it was always very respectful, and all 3 of us were there, you know, celebrating the end work together. You know, so my experiences in collaboration have always been very comfortable, and I'm never so protective about a movie that I'm going to be defensive, you know, because it's, you know, it takes a village, you know, and you do get written out in things, and you're sort of like, at a certain point, if the process has been going on so long, you know, there are points where you say, I'm written out, I don't have anything new, please get a fresh voice in here, you know. But it's in a weird way the equivalent of like previews for a show, for a play. Like, that's when you're there and you need other people responding at a certain point, because you can't take it any further.
Are there people you most admire dramatically, whether directors or writers in their crafts?
Yeah, I mean, you know, I don't want to talk about my contemporaries. I don't want to insult anyone, but you know, certainly, you know, the screenwriter, you know, the writer probably I most admire as a dramatist is O'Neill. Because of the incredible range of his work, you know, and that to me is staggering. And people are impressed I do different things, but Eugene O'Neill could give you The Hairy Ape and Our Wilderness and Long Day's Journey into Night. You know, completely different kinds of dramatic beasts, every one of them, and completely fully realized. So, you know, when people talk about the great American dramatist, and, you know, if anyone raises Tennessee Williams, I'm like, with all respect, you know, love me, my cat, and a hot tin roof. But he has no Eugene O'Neill, because that is a man who stretched himself and challenged himself everywhere. You know, and in terms of cinema, you know, definitely Ben Hecht. You know, because Ben Hecht could write Scarface, he could write Notorious, he could go and write a play, he could write a socialist tract, and he was so actively involved, you know, in everything he did, and you know, apparently a challenging but eager collaborator. You know, a man who could collaborate with Howard Hughes one day and then Alfred Hitchcock the next is pretty good at doing his job.
So I do want to talk about Red, obviously, but I want to circle back to, I would love to know, from what I've read and researched, you know, the Red came about while you were working on Sweeney Todd in London,
Yeah.
and collaborating with Stephen Sondheim. So I would love to have you share with us, you know, that conversation and what brought you back to the theater, because it sounds so beautiful.
Yeah, I mean, it really was in retrospect. You know, when you're living stuff, sometimes you don't know big events have happened, but then sometimes you do. So Sam Mendes started talking about doing a movie of Sweeney Todd. And that's, you know, I saw Sweeney Todd when I was a kid at the then Uris Theater, and I was, you know, in the back balcony, and I saw the final preview, and I saw it twice more during the run. You know, it was Angela Lansbury and Len Cariou, and it was one of the most thrilling evenings I've ever had in the theater, and to this day, the only time I've ever been frightened in the theater. when Len Carrier was doing Epiphany at the end of the first act, he's prowling the stage like a tiger, and I'm sitting in row Z in the balcony. I literally thought he was going to rip my throat out. He was so frightening performing that number. So I love Sweeney Todd. So Sam and I developed it. Sam had a long relationship with Steve, you know, and it was terrific. But the day came, I had to meet Stephen Sondheim, you know, and talk about Sweeney Todd, which many consider his masterwork. And so, you know, Sam and I went to his house in New York, and I was very nervous, you know, and he was incredibly gracious because he's a big movie fan, which helped. And practically the first words out of my mouth to him had to be, Steve, we're going to cut half your score because the show's 3.5 hours. And he sort of thought about it. He's like, yeah, okay, that makes sense, you know? And that was it. And then we spent years working on it, you know, developing a script with Sam, you know, working with Steve, you know, on his original manuscripts. So I could say, how did a song like Joanna come? When Anthony sings that in the first act, where did that come from? Why did it evolve like that? So it was a master class in musical theater. And it was also a master class in collaboration, because Steve's taught me some of the most important lessons I still carry to this day about how to work in the theater, especially in the musical theater. So finally, Tim Burton came on to direct the film. Great relationship. And I was one of the producers, so I was in London, you know, for all the filming and the pre-recording, which was very exciting because it's Sweeney Todd. And Steve would come occasionally, and we'd spend a lot of time together. And there's no man of the theater more active than Steve Sondheim. He sees everything. He's constantly going to the theater, and I would go with him sometimes, you know. And he started in his way to sort of nudge a little bit. It's like, you should write another play. I'm like, yeah, I know. I have this movie and this movie. It's like, no. There's all, you know, the world has enough screenwriters. We need some playwrights. You should write a play. So he kept after me. And then we were filming the movie, and I was staying in Soho, and I would take long walks on the weekends and things. And I happened to go to the Tate Modern, where the Seagram's murals were, you know, Rothko Seagram's murals. And they were then in a room, in a sort of dark room, the way he wanted them to be, in a sort of dark room, dark gray room, and they completely surrounded you. And I knew they were Rothko's, but I didn't know much about him really. So I read the little description on the gallery wall, and I instantly knew it was a play, and I knew it was a two-hander, and I knew it was Rothko and his assistant. I just knew exactly what it was. And the dimensions of the room very much matched the dimensions of Rothko's studio in the Bowery, and also the dimensions of the Donmar Warehouse, which is, along with Victor Gardens, my favorite theater space in the world. So I wrote it for that space, thinking that would be ideal for it. And so when it came time to dedicate the play, I dedicated it to Steve.
Did I can't help but I recognize the first line in Red and the last line in Sunday in the Park with George, and how they just are so beautifully entwined. You know, your line, what do you see? And the last line of Sunday in the Park, white, a blank page or canvas, his face, his favorite, so many possibilities. And when I reread those two things before this call, I was just so deeply moved that it was dedicated, and it was dedicated in such a way that was just so beautiful.
Completely. And it's inspired by Steve. And certainly Sunday in the Park with George is something that was constantly the soundtrack of my mind, because it's such the quintessential perfect presentation of an artist's soul. It also contains the quote I use more than any other when I'm running a TV show, which I'm doing now. Because when you're running a TV show, you have to make 1,000 decisions a second. What does that hat look like? Who's the director? How does this work? You know, where do you want the count? 1,000 decisions a second. There's a great quote from Sunday in the Park with George, where George sings, "The choice may have been mistaken, the choosing was not." And I always say that to people. It's like, I may make a wrong choice, but I'm going to give you a choice right now. Yeah.
Did you have any idea how successful critically Red would be? I mean, no. You know, I believe, you know, 6 Tony Awards, and I think it still holds the Tonys for the most Tonys for a play. Did that even occur to you as you were crafting it? No.
No, I never had a play on Broadway. I'd never had a play except for, you know, small off-Broadway, you know. And when we were working on it, you know, it was like, you know, Eddie Redmayne, Alfred Molina, Christopher Orr, Michael Granage, and me, the little Donmar crew in the freezing rehearsal room in London. we thought we had a beautiful piece of theater. We didn't think anyone else was necessarily going to like it at all, because it's a strange play when you think about it. And then we did a run through for just the people who worked in the theater. And that's the first time I started saying, oh, wow, people are really strangely responding to this. And, it was very gratifying. And, to this day, I remember walking down the street and seeing the marquee for Red on Broadway, and just with my name, the same theaters I had gone to when I was 13, 14, 15, and buying half price tickets, going in on matinees with my mom. And it was in the same theaters. It's an overpowering moment.
And Red was sort of another pivotal moment, because it really brought you back into the theater world in a big way. I mean, and
Right.
With working with Sondheim on the musical, it's sort of, there's been a shift in the last, 6 years of your work, whether it's The Last Ship, Moulin Rouge. Like, how did you find your way into into really the musical theater world? Was it Joe and Joe Mantello who brought you into The Last Ship? Was it, I know there was personal investment there because of your father in working on The Last Ship. How did you enter the new space of musical theater world?
Well, it's, what it comes from is just the childish glee in musicals I always loved. And, to this day, the first piece of theater I remember seeing is a high school production of West Side Story. And I could still tell you what Tony was wearing in the last scene. It made such an impression. And I always loved musical theater. I love going to it. I love listening to cast albums. My mother will tell you stories about me, like singing the entire My Fair Lady cast album with my dad's hat, But I have no musical ability at all. But I always thought, well, okay, so maybe someday I'll write the book to a musical. And it was one of those things I always wanted to do. And I think Red gave me the confidence to say, all right, let's take a risk. I've written movies. I've enjoyed that. I won a Tony Award. That's great. So let's do something really scary. So I started talking to a lot of composers, my friend Tom Kitt, Adam Gettle, about various projects, teasing things out. And, I'd known Joe Mantello, fantastic director and actor, and he and Sting came to me, with The Last Ship. And I said, yes, let's do it. And then The Last Ship was just an incredible learning. It was like my training school, for how a musical is put together and what it takes. And, as when you walk into rehearsals for a straight play, there's like 12 people there. When you walk in rehearsals for Moulin Rouge, there's 70 people there. Just like, what do they all do for one? And where do I fit? Where does the book writer fit in the process of a musical? And it is a tricky position, because the book writer is constantly fighting to rehearse the book scenes. But then the choreography department, they need to rehearse. And the music department needs to rehearse. And the scenic department needs to rehearse. And, and there's only so many equity hours to rehearse in. And that's so the poor director has to sit there with like a whip in his hand, keeping down the beast and trying to keep everything moving, which I will say, like, what's the most difficult job in show business? And I've been involved in a lot of show business now. It's not directing a Gladiator, it's directing a Broadway musical, because the time demands are so severe and the money is so dangerously high to put a musical on. Even a small musical requires a grant or a corporate funding or anything to make it feasible. And yet it is still the most magical art form, without a doubt. So I've loved working on musicals. I'm working on one now. It's great. It's great.
Can you talk about the Moulin Rouge experience a bit? I mean, that I imagine there were conversations with Baz Luhrmann about what he wanted, what he didn't want, the permission he gave you to make it your own, and what that shepherding that entire thing was like for you.
Yeah, it was actually a surprisingly effortless. You'd think it would be a bear, but it wasn't, because Baz Luhrmann is incredibly generous. And he wanted Alex Timbers to direct the show, and he wanted the artists to make it their own. The first thing he said to me was, I don't want you to just put the movie on stage. I want you to make this new, because cinema and the theater are completely different beasts, and they have different requirements. So for me, it started with a call from Alex Timbers, the director, and we just talked, and we saw the exact same show right from the beginning. We'd spent time, studied the movie. I'd gone to the Fox vault, studied every draft of the screenplay. So I had it in my bones to know what was comfortable, what wasn't, what could adapt easily, what couldn't, what were the iconic moments we had to try to capture, and where could we have variation. And our show is a radically new beast, you know, when you look at the movie and the show side by side. But it was all because of Baz's benevolence. He was never protective of the experience. He gave absolutely the best notes. You know, he'd only watch it occasionally, like a one through of a lab or something. Then we'd sit and have a big meeting, and he would always ask me the best questions and give me the best notes, because he and Craig Pierce, who wrote the screenplay, obviously knew it so well, you know. And he was incredible, and the whole team was really functioning at the peak efficiency, which for a show that big you sort of need to.
I'm sure that the cast and the crew of that show on Broadway are waiting breathlessly to get back in the space. I know many of your cast members, a few of them were hit by COVID early, so I'm sure you're thinking about them, and we're all sending them our best.
Of course.
Was Penny Dreadful your first TV foray, or was it? And so what was it? Just again, like, I've done this, I want to do TV now. Why not? Because you are a risk taker.
It was a combination of things. It was a bit sort of like, why not do a musical? What's the worst that can happen? I mean, I actually own my house, so they can't take my house away. So why not? You know, and it really came, I think, honestly, more than anything, from loving sort of Dickens so much and 19th century novels. And, you know, as a dramatist, you're always working in the 2 hour or 2.5 hour box. And I thought, what would it be like to write longer than that? You know, what would it be like to have characters you could spin out for 10 hours or 30 hours? Would that be cool? Would that not be cool? Would I enjoy that? And I was reading a lot of romantic poetry at the time, particularly Wordsworth. And I just sort of started studying the Romantics, which eventually led me back to Mary Shelley, you know, and to Frankenstein. I thought, oh, maybe I could write a long form Frankenstein. But I thought, well, A, that's been done, and B, I wanted to write something female-centric, you know, because a lot of my work is really masculine and very testosterone-y. So I wanted to write something with a female protagonist. And that's how I came up with the original Penny Dreadful. I thought about the metaphor of a woman in 1890s London, literally and figuratively corseted and wanting to break out of that. And so able to take all my love of horror, Gothic literature, romantic poetry, you know, and, you know, if the original 3 seasons of Penny Dreadful has so much poetry, there's Wordsworth, there's Keats, there's John Clare, there's Shelley, you know, everywhere, Christina Rossetti, you know, to be able to put all of that under one Gothic umbrella seemed really fun. And scary, and I didn't know if I could do it, but that's when I was working on the 2 Bonds with Sam Mendes, and he said, "Of course you can do it. Well, I'll do it with you. Let's do this thing," you know. And sort of his sort of ebullient confidence, you know, sort of made me very confident too, you know. And so we did the 3 seasons of Penny Dreadful, which we filmed in Dublin, you know, which was fantastic. And it was a great experience. I loved doing it. I loved running the show. I loved writing that much, you know. And I sort of, like, you know, as I said, I write a lot. I write quickly, and I just sort of really, you know, enjoy it. And so I did that series, and then I'm doing the new one now. So I guess I'm doing okay so far.
Are you allowed to share the things you're working on without giving anything away you're not allowed to give away?
Yeah, of course. You know, I'm you know, the majority of my work now is divided up between a new musical I cannot talk about, I'm sorry to say, or Scott Rudin will kill me. And I'm writing a very, very big movie about Michael Jackson. So I've been researching Michael, you know, for the last year. So there's a lot of Michael Jackson going on, which is obviously an interesting and challenging subject for all the reasons you'd imagine.
Yes, indeed. John, you were about the most Hollywood living, you know, person I've ever talked to or even read about. I think you really don't you don't enter the work thinking about awards. You don't subscribe to any of that scene. What do you do for you? How do you self-care? What are your hobbies?
Well, I only have one hobby, and it's why I live in California, which is I hike. You know, I'm a fanatical hiker, you know, and one of the reasons I start work so early is so I can get done and go hiking. And so almost every day, you know, the Santa Monica Mountains of California are some of the most beautiful trails, you know, in the country, if not in the world. And I hike and I hike and I hike at great length. And so you know, sometimes I do endurance hiking. Every summer I go to Death Valley in the hottest week of the year for 2 weeks, just by myself. And I sort of burn everything out of me and I do endurance hiking. That's really like the only hobby I have, quite frankly, because I'm really happy, you know, just doing my work. And, you know, there's a lot of variety in a playwright's life and a dramatist's life.
Right. Is there anything in this moment, in our you know, sheltering in place moment, that you have found that you were surprised was helpful in your process, that you're going to keep as you move through our reopening? And then, of course, there are many things we all want to leave behind, but any special nuggets you're like, I'm going to hold on to that?
Well, I'm going to hold on to this. I'm going to hold on to video conferencing, you know, because if you live in LA, it's a 2-hour drive to any meeting. And it's like, you know what? I've seen all you people in real life. I don't really need to sit around a table. We could just communicate like this. I would definitely keep this. But, you know, it's a uniquely complicated time to be a writer, because on one hand, I have nothing to do but write. There's no distractions. I couldn't see people if I wanted to, you know. So that's, in a way, great. I hate to say it, but it is. If you're a committed writer, this is the time to write something new, you know. The same way I know choreographers are working, you know, doing Zoom sessions with dancers, and, you know, painters are painting like crazy. So it's an incubation period for a lot of things. But look, my job requires living, human, breathing people to see it. I'm not a novelist. I'm not a painter. I'm not a poet. I'm a dramatist. And if audiences aren't seeing it, and particularly in the live theater, if they're not sort of breathing at the same time with the actors, then it's useless. There's no point to do it.
Yeah. Would you if there was a young writer fresh out of Northwestern or DePaul, one of our Chicago young folks listening today, are there any words of wisdom you might give to them?
Yeah, it's really simple. Keep your head down and do your job. It is. Do not be distracted. It's so easy to be distracted by reviews, success, awards, competitors, companions, especially in the social media age where the presentation of self is so important. All of that is a huge distraction. The reality is, it's you and your keyboard or your pencil. That is all that matters. Keep your head down and do your work, because only if you do that will you create anything original, meaningful, and personal. And if you don't do that, do not call yourself a dramatist, because there are enough hacks in the world. If you want to be serious about it, be serious and do not look around. That's the way I've been able to survive doing this now 40 years, is I keep my head down and I do my job, and I love my job. So, you know, so far for me, so good.
That's great. We have a young playwright who's going to be with us this summer for our Ignition Festival, a new playwright out of the MFA at Northwestern, actually.
Oh, great.
And is thankful that I randomly asked that question. So it's a great answer. I want to open the chat room if anyone does have a question they want to pose to John. We have about 10 minutes left. Okay, here's a question. John, in what ways do you think the sheer volume of stories that audiences consume now, TV, podcasts, affect the kind of stories that audiences seek or crave via theater specifically? Or do you think it's the same as ever? A good story is a good story is a good story.
Yeah, that's a really smart question. It's the question that I discuss with my colleagues, my professional colleagues, more than any other, which is there are so many outlets for people to take in entertainment or theater, that how do they know where to choose? How are you not following the trend? You know, I think here's the two ways to maybe look at it. On one hand, you could be a zeitgeist artist and respond to this moment in a very hot, flashing way, where the synapses jump very quickly to this world we're in and all the sort of the sort of various voices at play in it. Totally legitimate way to work, and a lot of my friends do that. And then there's the other way to work, which realizes that if you're writing something elemental about the human condition, that is universal, and universal can be a junkyard in a David Mamet play, or can be the vast world of Cymbeline. That is what will finally last, the age. And the only thing that really matters, honestly, is like, do you believe what you're saying? Do you believe your characters? Are you giving them something important and meaningful to say? Because it's not enough to think, I would love to win an Oscar. I'd love to have a tone. I'd love to be on Broadway, have a show on Broadway. That would be great. Like, no, it wouldn't. Not unless it's meaningful, not unless you're doing something, because you're responsible for what you're saying. Every word that Mark Rothko says, I'm responsible for, whether I believe it or not. You're putting an emotion and an idea out into the world. And so there's a, I take it seriously, and there is a responsibility to being a dramatist. That's a very sort of a circuitous answer.
No, really, really great. Somebody's asked, how is the theater experience impacted by watching a play being streamed versus live in this moment? And do you think there are plays that might translate better to streaming?
No plays should translate to streaming. And I speak as someone who's had plays streamed. It's okay, but it's like looking at something from a lens through a lens. And theater is not cinema. And I work in both forms, as do many writers. And there's something dead about watching a play, on videotape. Having said that, I've watched a lot of them. I've enjoyed a lot of them. I've learned, if you go to Lincoln Center and go to their library and say, hey, I wonder what, the original production of Pacific Overtures was like. You can see a representation of it, but you're not seeing the real thing. As we know, theater is a real thing between people, and it's about the air between them and about the molecules in the room vibrating all at the same time, which makes it, for me, magical. So when that's reduced to a flat screen that you can pause if you like, and go get a soda and come back, I think it misses some of the inherent temporal suspense of being in an actual theater.
Yes, and we were speaking earlier just about, the horizontal experience of you in a space at a certain time with an audience, and what that horizontal experience is as compared to, the importance of the vertical experience to you and the artists. And I know we're all hoping for the day we can be back in our shared spaces, yeah, doing these types of events on stage instead of off stage, if you will.
Exactly.
We probably have room for one more question. Does anyone have here comes one. Oh no, somebody just wants to binge all of your work.
Yeah, go for it. If you do, I'll make some money, so thank you.
What is your favorite work of yours in both film and do you have a favorite that you're like, I love that?
I do have favorites. I mean, it's in theater, I think Red, because of what it meant to me as a human being at that point in my life, is still the most important, because it just sort of slapped me in the face and said, get back to the theater. And once I did, I was like, my God, this is where I need to be. And in film, I'm really proud of The Aviator, which is a movie I did with Marty Scorsese, because it was a bear to do, and I think it's a beast that became a beautiful thing for me.
Have you ever experienced burnout? Just enough? I need to or do you just, when you experience it, that's what the hiking and the 2 weeks in Death Valley, that's what that's for? Do you ever get stuck?
No. Never
get stuck in your writing?
No, I mean, yes, I get stuck where I sort of like, I can't figure out this scene, but then I just move on to the next scene and come back to it. I don't sort of like beat my head against a wall till it's bloody. Just personally for me, it's like, if I write a scene, I realize, okay, that's not quite right. I'll just keep going and eventually come back to it, because, God is in the rewriting, not the writing. Anyone can write a first draft. It's the 12th draft that kills you.
That's fantastic. I want to, oh yes. John, you've also stepped into producing theater as well. So I just want to touch on that. Is that something you're going to continue to do? I know you produced Natasha Pierre and The Great Comet and that piece. Is there anything else that why did that excite you in that moment, producing as well?
It was, I think producing is a generous term for I gave a lot of money to. frankly, because a theater producer, I never want to be, because that's oh, hey, you cat, because that's
John, that's Martha. That's
oh,
Martha.
of course. Yeah, so I mean, Pierre Natasha and the Great Comet was a great work of theater that I saw in tiny little Ars Nova space in New York. And I said, this artist needs to be encouraged. Let me give you money to keep developing this show. And that was it. And it's like the responsibility of someone who lives in Malibu looking over the ocean is to give money to people who need it, and to give it to theaters and to people who support it. I wouldn't be here if people hadn't been generous with Victory Gardens or with Stormfield or with me personally when I was broke. And so any chance I have to give money to back to the theater that started my whole life and gave me my whole life, of course I'm going to do it. Why wouldn't I?
Wow, that's really, I can't think of a more beautiful way to end the conversation, because you've been really giving back today with your time, and just delightful. I know we all want to thank you so much for giving us these amazing thoughts, and your humility and just your kindness. You're just an incredibly, incredibly kind person. And it seeps through your emails and your texts and your phones, and it definitely seeped through this. I'm so, so grateful to you. I want to obviously thank everybody who joined us today. We're doing a number of these Your World Offstage conversations over the next month with our directors and writers of our season next year, the 2021 season. We're also going to be broadcasting our Ignition Festival of New Work. We're going to do 4 virtual readings of new plays by Chicago writers, directed by Chicago directors, and it will, of course, be Chicago actors involved. So we hope you'll go to the website, www.victorygardens.org, to sign up for any of those in advance. We'd love to have you. And of course, to John's point, right now, with our theaters closed and our buildings shut down, and wanting to preserve our people and pay our artists and staff, I encourage you, if you can, to make a small donation. No donation is too small. We could certainly use and appreciate your support. And John, thank you so much again for being with us to launch this Your World Offstage series. Really wonderful.
My pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye, Erica.
Take care. Bye.